very important moment of our conference, we'll have our first keynote address delivered by Professor Adrian Papahagi from the Babeș-Bolyai University of Cluj, the English Bard and French Theory. Yesterday, when I was talking to Professor Papahagi, he asked me to introduce him just as our colleague from Cluj, and that should be all. So I'm going to be a man of my word, and I'm going to begin with Professor Adrian Papahagi is our colleague from Cluj, who has a PhD from the University of Sorbonne in Paris, who was a research fellow at the University of Oxford, at the University of London, and who gave academic talks all over the world. He is also the author of the famous series known as Shakespeare Interpreted by Adrian Papahagi, which luckily, I would say, from an intellectual and cultural viewpoint, is published here in Iași at Polyrom. He already published 9 books from this series, which aims at becoming an overall critical approach to Shakespeare's literary work. This is a major project, and I'm really envious about that when I take a look at the series of books already arranged in a certain order on my desk. Professor Adrian Papahagi also wrote another significant book about Shakespeare, Shakespeare's Problem Plays and Romances, Providence and Grace, Shakespeare's Problem Plays and Romances in 2020, well received by Shakespeareologists and specialists, not only in Romania, but in other parts of the world. Adrian Papahagi studied, and I believe this makes him one of the kind, at least in Romania. He studied Anglo-Latin studies in Paris. He studied Old English. He speaks Old English. He studied different fields which are considered usually very narrow by specialists, but they are extremely important. And he compares his work, and now I could quote for him, but I'm not going to quote because he's already giving me a cold shoulder because of my long presentation. He speaks about his method of work as being digging, like an archaeologist, and looking for truth by using different cultural forms of manifestation, such as the history of ideas, such as the old languages, Greek and Latin, and so on. He's like an archaeologist. I would say he's more a philologist, but a philologist in the true sense of the word. That type of philologist who combines the fields of expertise. And this is actually what makes him one of the kind, as I was saying before. I'm just going to add, and I'm going to stop. I don't want to make him angry. I just want to add that he's also a civic voice, probably one of the most important ones today in Romania. And we need voices like that. I'm pretty sure that everybody here is aware of that. If you follow him in all his public positions, you are going to see the moral clarity and the intellectual clarity with which he dissects, and I'm using the word in its old tradition established by Roland Barthes, in which he dissects reality, he dissects the truth. It's an honor for us to have him as a keynote speaker today, and I'm looking forward to listening to his interpretation of Shakespeare's literature and ideology. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Cuțitaru, dear friend, dear Codrin. This is exactly what I feared, the anticlimax following. after this glorious presentation of my humble academic achievements. Now, today, so much has been said about Shakespeare and also about ideology and theory that actually I'm treading on charted territory here. Much has been said about power, 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 power. That's the obsession today. Although we are not running for office, everybody in academia is obsessed with power, as if academia's main topic was not literature, beauty, truth, human nature, whatever. No, it's power, 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 power. All right, I'm going to talk about power, but not from the position that you expect. And then, of course, Codrin Cuțitaru's splendid story about his 4 meetings with his supervisor in Arizona are so characteristic. And I'm so glad, Codrin, that you have already said half of what I have to say here about Othello, King Lear, storms, blackness, and such like. Now, Shakespeare has often been regarded as our contemporary. In Romania, if you ask people about Shakespeare, the only thing they have ever read and know about is Ioan Cuza, Shakespeare, our contemporary. Actually, they know the title very well. Few people, I think, have actually read it. But wherever you go, is Shakespeare still our contemporary? Shakespeare, our contemporary? That's all you are expected to talk about. And that doesn't start with Ioan Cuza in the 1960s. It starts already with Ben Jonson in the prefatory poem to the first folio edition of Shakespeare's works from 1623, where Ben Jonson wrote, "Triumph, my Britain, thou hast won to show, to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. He was not of an age, but for all time." Shakespeare was, for all time, not of one age, and of course that makes him our contemporary as well, thank God, and this is why we still talk about him considerably more than about Ben Jonson, for example. It was indeed a momentous book, the one that Ioan Cuza published in 1965 in English translation, earlier in Polish, where he remarked that Shakespeare is that modern dramatists like Brecht, Dürrenmatt, or Beckett are considerably closer to Shakespeare than to the drama of the preceding century, of the 19th century. And the reason for that is that Shakespeare, in a way, anticipates the concerns of these modern authors, one of the qualities being, of course, that he anticipated the theatre of the absurd. Through grotesque and other things, he says, and I'm going to quote, that the striking feature of the new theatre is its grotesque quality. Grotesque means tragedy rewritten in different terms. The downfall of the tragic hero is a confirmation and recognition of the absolute, whereas the downfall of the grotesque actor means mockery of the absolute and its desecration. The grotesque is more cruel than tragedy. The absolute becomes absurd. And from this point of view, King Lear has become an absurd play and a play of the grotesque. Very many Romanian stagings of Richard III, of King Lear, of other plays actually follow Ioan Cuza because they follow Peter Brook, and consequently they follow this fashion. Here is an example from a recent production of Richard III at one of the greatest theatres in Bucharest, Teatru Bulandra, by one of the greatest Romanian stage directors, Andrei Șerban. Now, if you look at it, they look grotesque, don't they? And the crowns that they have on their heads are little black cardboard, fake crowns, coronets, that no one would really kill for. These are Richard and his brothers, some sort of grotesque idiots, Now, all of this is pretty far from Shakespeare's idea of the English crown, which, of course, Laurence Olivier captured a bit better in his famous film from 1955. And Richard's obsession is not with some sort of phony cardboard coronet with a grotesque fancy, but with the English crown, for which he is willing to kill everybody who stands in his way. already in the third part of Henry VI, Gloucester says that he'll make his heaven to dream upon the crown, and whilst I live to account this world but hell, until my misshaped trunk that bears this head be round impaled with a glorious crown. And yet I know not how to get the crown, for many lives stand between me and home. And I torment myself to catch the English crown, and from that torment I will free myself, or hew my way out with a bloody axe. So you see, the English crown, dream upon the crown, glorious crown, get the crown. This, of course, falls very neatly into the political theology of what it meant to be King of England in the age of Elizabeth and James I. But it certainly doesn't fit in the modern understanding of crowns, kings, and the vainglories of this world in a literature of the absurd and the grotesque. I would like to draw your attention, by the way, that Shakespeare is closer to Richard III than he is to us. From Richard III to Shakespeare's writing Richard III, only 100 years had elapsed, which is, roughly speaking, the period that separates us from the foundation of the English department here. That's not ancient history, it's not medieval history, is it? It's modern, recent history to us. So from Richard to Shakespeare, the distance is no longer than from King Ferdinand I to, say, Andrei Pleșu, right? I didn't know what Romanian to compare to Shakespeare. I didn't want to choose Cărtărescu because I don't like him that much. But after, in the period following Jan Kott's claim that Shakespeare was our contemporary, people started doubting it, so that only a few decades later, 2 decades to be precise, a book asked whether Shakespeare was still our contemporary. And as you can see in the table of contents of this book edited by John Elsom, some stage directors and scholars asked if Shakespeare was sexist, if Shakespeare was too English. What else would you expect him to be? But anyway, if he's a feudal propagandist, or if he should be buried or born again, downright. A feminist stage director called Sue Parrish answered the question whether Shakespeare was sexist in the following way. The short answer is yes, and the longer answer is yes. It's considerably longer, as you can see. I think that there is a fundamental inequality and difference in the way in which Shakespeare treats his male and female characters. Yes, for those of you who know historical reasons, is that females were played by young boys, and they were not such good actors as adult actors, right, consummate male actors, and that's the reason why he didn't have that many female parts in his plays. So it's a historical reason rather than an ideological one, but that doesn't really matter to Sue Parrish, does it? What had happened between 65, when Shakespeare was considered our contemporary, and 85, when they started doubting that Shakespeare was our contemporary, and they started relegating him to a distant, shameful, of course, past, because the past very seldom has the ability to anticipate our modern, our modern progress and to adapt to it at a quick pace. So Shakespeare, of course, is guilty of being of his time, not only of our time. What had come in between is what I called in the title French theory, because it sounded good, you know, English bard and French theory, but French theory is not that French after all, as we all know. First of all, it's German. Now, the French wouldn't like to know that or to acknowledge that, but it all started with the Frankfurt School, which of course launched the so-called critical theory. You see here in this picture some of them, Horkheimer, Adorno, Habermas in the background. You don't see Marcuse, who were forced to emigrate to America during Hitler's Machtkrieg, and then they, mainly at Columbia, but also at other American universities, Marcuse stayed there to bless American academia with his insight into sex and liberation. The others came back to Germany after the war, but they invented what was called the critical theory, a series of theories, actually, not just one, that aim, as a recent article in a Encyclopedia of Philosophy informs us, that aim a critique and transformation of society. So you see, this is not, how should I say, dispassionate academic contemplative work. It is in some sorts militant work. It has a political aim, the transformation of society, not merely the study of society. It is rooted in the Western European Marxist tradition, combines philosophy and social science with the practical aim of furthering emancipation, that's an important word, and as such, it has inspired or contributed to such theories or movements as feminist theory, critical race theory, queer theory, post-colonial, decolonial theory, and of course, you know those better than I do. The French came later, but they used the same Marxist background, the same materialist Marxist opposition, obsessed, of course, with the ideas of power and agency, working on a scheme that constantly opposes the oppressor to the oppressed and speaks about oppression. Now, of course, the oppressed could be a class, the working class, a sex, females, then, of course, no longer the sex, genders, and even women can be oppressors, we have learned, of other genders. Then finally species, now animals are the oppressed. And finally, in our days, nature itself. Men, it's not only white men that are evil, but men in general, people, because they destroy nature. This is the materialist reading of reality. To this came the French critique of the subject, of the text, represented by authors who not always liked each other or agreed with each other, but which can be viewed more or less as a group: Deleuze, Lacan, Foucault, Derrida, and from them, of course, American scholars, because this French theory, too, became French once it crossed the ocean, and then, of course, it was no longer as French as we think. The targets of French theory, François Cuza tells us in his study of Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and their impact on American intellectual life, the targets of French theory, which we also know as cultural studies, with all its currents, feminism, post-colonialism, postmodernism, post-humanism, canon wars, deconstruction, political correctness, and all. The targets of these are the text as the product of an author between brackets, because we know that texts are produced by social energies, not by authors. The death of the author was proclaimed already before this by Barthes and others. Containing a meaning is imperialist, the forced neutrality of an imperialist reason, universalism as a weapon of the West, there is no such thing as a universal human nature, or else the canon as a form of literary colonialism. These terms punctuated a certain political radicalization of academic discourse. And this is indeed what we are witnessing today, and which is going onwards, as Evelyn Gajowski explains in a very recent book on contemporary Shakespeare criticism. The political dimension of Shakespeare's texts, emphasized by postmodern critical practices of 1970s and 80s, continues to develop, combined with an extended, explicit consideration of otherness, critical race studies, post-colonial queer studies, and so on. All of these, rooted into Marxist and historicist practices, intend to make a case for the visibility and the voice of people of color, colonized peoples, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, trans, star, I don't know what the star stands for, but I suppose it can stand for anything, and queers in Shakespeare's texts, as in contemporary society. In so doing, they not coincidentally argue for the necessity of their occupying subject rather than object positions to construct meaning. All right. And of course, the target, as you all know, is the elitist, white, European, heterosexual male. Me and Cuțitaru, for example, we have to be dethroned. Now, I must tell you that like Codrin, who was graded A but couldn't read his papers in class, I had the same problem at the Sorbonne when I criticized Lacan, but there they almost threw me out. And finally, I got an A too. But I really feared I would not pass that crucial exam and lose my scholarship and return to Romania like a failure that I was for not conforming to ideology. And then I didn't even dare write about Shakespeare for about 20 years until I became a full tenured professor, and I couldn't fear anything, or so I hope. And then I started saying exactly what I thought about Shakespeare, which was pretty much similar to what Codrin had to say about Shakespeare. I stuck to medieval literature because there you need to know Old English and philology and Latin and manuscript studies, and that's not something that people like very much these days. Now, of course, ideology has evolved because people have to write something new all the time, right? They can't just write the old stuff and shoot rag, and they have to invent new intersections, and now it's fashionable to talk about ecofeminism, and of course, ecofeminism draws parallels between the oppression of nature and the oppression of women. Women also can oppress nature, I should say, but perhaps less than men. And finally, post-humanist, because now that we have identified all the oppressors, it's time for a collective suicide, because ultimately we realize that we're all the oppressors of nature, and we should give way and stop destroying nature. The only problem of modern ideology is they don't know how to handle Shakespeare exactly. Some of them think he was the old reactionary party and should be got rid of, like all the Western canon. Others claim him as a predecessor, of course, and someone who had foresight and anticipated the progress. But in any case, Shakespeare, one critic wrote, stood on a threshold between the emerging Western humanist anthropocentric worldview, and we stand at the end in the final phase of the humanist Eurocentric and anthropocentric modernity. So in both cases, we question the fact that there is an essential human nature. And when you read King Lear, and you remember Lear's famous question, is man no more than that? You may think that they have a point, but do they? Now, I'm going to see how all of this applies to Shakespeare, and if it holds water, and how pertinent it is. Of course, Shakespeare gives us plenty of occasions to question his work from all these perspectives. For example, in terms of gay studies, it is famous that he dedicates his sonnets to two loves, right? A man right fair and a woman cholered ill. Two loves I have of comfort and despair, which like two spirits do suggest me still. The better angel is a man right fair, the worse a spirit, a woman cholered ill, right? So obviously, he had a gay lover and a dark woman. The gay lover, between brackets, inverted commas, he calls the master mistress of my passion, which in itself is quite telling. So from here, of course, we have to give the voice to those who are underrepresented and whose voice must be heard. And there is a whole line, very flourishing, very prosperous, of queer Shakespeare studies. However beautiful and enlightening this is, one should rather understand Shakespeare in the context in which he wrote. And here am I pleading for the historical philological method of interpreting texts in the context and in which they were written, and trying to find an authorial meaning, which of course theory has discarded. Now, as you all know, between 1591 and 1597, almost every writer, major and minor, in England was writing sonnets. 2,000 of them were written, 1,200 of which are love sonnets, in just a few years in late Elizabethan England. These sonnets were mostly, they came by tens or hundreds even. They were generally dedicated to women who, of course, did not exist. Here you see Idea, right? Phyllis, the idea of love, Celia, sky, Zephyria, the wind, Diella, goddess, Fidessa, faithful, Laura, taken from Petrarch, Aurora, Celica, Pertenophe. These are the women, not actual Elizabethan women. Shakespeare's problem when he started writing sonnets was, of course, how to be original within a tradition. Because at that time, original didn't mean destroying the tradition altogether or deconstructing it, but it was being, in a way, subversive inside a tradition. Now, how could he write to a woman who is always described like this? Fair is my love, this is from Samuel Daniel's Delia. Fair is my love and cruel as she's fair, her brow shades frowns, although her eyes are sunny, her smiles are lightning, though her pride despair, and her disdains are gall, her favors honey. This is the typical description of La Belle Dame sans merci, cruel but beautiful. She is fair, but fair, of course, is always a pun in Shakespeare and his contemporaries, because fair could mean blonde, could mean beautiful, but could also mean fair in the way we understand it today, and in the way Shakespeare understood it when he asked Ophelia, "Are you fair?" And she didn't understand the question. What do you mean, am I fair? Am I fair to you? Am I beautiful? What do you mean? And then he said that if you be honest and fair, your honesty should admit no discourse to your beauty. Actually, he meant both, as Hamlet often does. Right? Fair, the fair woman of the sonnets, comes from a medieval tradition in which whiteness meant purity. And one allegory of whiteness is the medieval English poem, the Middle English poem Pearl, composed at the age of Chaucer, at the age of Richard II, about whom Shakespeare wrote, around 1390, 1400. And there a dreamer sees a beautiful young woman who is as beautiful as a lost pearl. The woman is a maiden of menskeful debonere, blissend de wit was her bland, a maid of very gentle bearing, gleaming white was her dress. Or he compares this woman to pearls, to white pearls, and finally to the Lamb, to Christ. So you see there are three allegories there. The pearl, an allegory of whiteness and purity. The woman, the maiden, an allegory of purity, and finally the sacrificial lamb, Christ himself. And now if you think of Othello, you will realize that Desdemona is all these three at the same time. She is a pearl richer than all his tribe, right? She is purity in the sense of innocence, sexual innocence, and so on. And she is in a way a sacrificial lamb of Othello's ire and of Iago's plotting. In all Elizabethan sonnets, without a single exception, the women are described as white, pure, and so on. Alabaster, pearl, marble are the staple elements to which women are compared in what is known also from a French medieval genre as the blason de la femme, a description of the woman in heraldic terms. Just as you describe a coat of arms, the woman's face is described. Now, Shakespeare had to deal with that. So what could he do? The first thing he does is that he praises his woman in exactly the same terms that were consecrated by sonnets, but he makes her black, right, and accessible. She's not the Belle Dame sans merci. She is some sort of a strumpet. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. If snow be white, why then her breasts are done. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground, says this famous sonnet. In the old age, black was not counted fair, and so on. But that was not enough for this incredible genius. He did something else. At the same time, he kept the purity and the inaccessibility of the woman. Only he turned that woman into a man. Because what is even more inaccessible than a woman? Well, a man. But the man is now the ideal woman, the idealized dedicatee of the sonnets, and the woman. So there is a doubling of the typical dedicatee. It's a game. He's just playing inside the tradition of sonnet writing. And as I try to argue, the fair goddess of other Elizabethan sonneteers is transformed by Shakespeare into an angelic, unnamed young man who becomes the inaccessible idea, the high Petrarchan ideal of sonneteers. And the dark, equally mysterious woman represents the visceral passion of the fabliaux. And if you have read medieval literature, you see that the conflict that you have there is always between the ideal, pure, white something and the visceral, bodily, and so on. They did have sex in the Middle Ages as well. Now, the other problem of these sonnets is, of course, the blackness, the darkness of the woman, and not only darkness, race, color have become obsessions in our world. Of course, more so in America, where they do have a reason for that, less so here, but by mimicry and imitation here too. So that nowadays it is inconceivable to produce a single Shakespeare play with only white actors or with only white actors in the main roles. And at the Globe, for example, the latest Romeo and Juliet was made almost entirely with people of color. Now that's very nice if you want to make an ideological point, but you risk being a bit ridiculous if you read the play. This is another snapshot from that show. But that, in a way, ignores Shakespeare's play on the fair woman and the description of Juliet. Juliet is described like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. And the idea of a woman who is white, beautiful, like a pearl in the medieval sense, in an Ethiop's ear, also appears in a Midsummer Night's Dream, where Lysander calls Hermia, away you Ethiop, and so on. Right? Hermia, as you know, is short and dark, and Helena is tall and fair. But fair also means the other thing, of course, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. Fair also means unfair, dishonest, and all the other things that I have already expressed. Of course, the question of race becomes much more pertinent and urgent in Othello, where black people are actually present in the play. They are not there in fair Verona. And in Othello, critics nowadays focus, of course, on the race issues. Annie Alumba, one of the most important scholars who focus on gender and race in Shakespeare's drama, wrote that it had been a major problem for critics of the play to reconcile Othello's blackness with his central position in the play. Therefore, either his color was ignored or much critical effort was expended in trying to prove that Shakespeare did not intend him to be black at all. I'm not much aware of such criticism, but that's what she says. Both views are premised upon racist notions of black inferiority. The operation of patriarchalism, that's another buzzword. It cannot be absent from any text written in the line of French theory. The operation of patriarchalism seeks to extend the control and authority of man as father and over women, and white man as father over black men and women. But is Othello really about that, about the patriarchal control of Desdemona and Othello? Is Brabantio there the main thing? No way. First of all, as Professor Cuțitaru told you, Brabantio really likes Othello. He's not at all a racist. He doesn't care that he's white or black, just he doesn't want his girl to marry to a man who is considerably older, first of all, and who he hasn't approved of. It is Iago who paints Othello in these racist colors when he describes him as an old black ram topping your white ewe. And of course, race is there in Othello. You cannot say that it's not about white or black and white, right, and so on. But in what context does it appear? As the Duke of Venice tells Brabantio, "Noble signor, your son-in-law is far more fair than black." And here you have the eternal Shakespeare pun on fair and foul. fair is foul and foul is fair in Macbeth. It's good and evil, actually. Black and white are symbols. This is a symbolic color. These are symbols, not racist things. Shakespeare is not interested in race issues. He's interested in symbols. And that's the clash between an author who writes in a symbolic paradigm and scholarship which reads him in a materialistic, realistic, ideological paradigms. It's a clash of paradigms. He didn't write in this paradigm. That's the only problem. So if we want to explain him, we have to understand what he meant there. My take on it is that Iago is actually the essential moral bodily blackness of Othello. Iago is the projection of the shadow, the heart of darkness, the repressed darkness of Othello's soul. The little white man, animated by hatred, is the black man, growing more powerful as the general loses his mind with jealousy. He is left to control the action and to destroy all that Othello has built: fame, honor, marriage. By the way, Othello is the most esteemed general of Venice when the play starts. Desdemona, on the other hand, has to be white, like the women of the sonnets and of the medieval tradition and so on. Because she's fair because Othello is unfair. She's white because his blackness comes from jealousy and passion. While Othello is disfigured by hatred, Desdemona participates almost detachedly in the nightmare she is living, I wrote. This goes on with other Shakespearean plays, and of course one of the most of the favorite plays for post-colonialist and race critical studies is The Tempest, starting with the Psychologie de la colonisation written by Octave Manoni in 1950, which was translated into English much later, but also, of course, with Stephen Greenblatt's important essays on studies on Shakespeare. Caliban is famously described in the Drama dis Persone as a savage and deformed slave. And the problem here, the word that caught the attention of scholars is, of course, slave in the most recent period. And Caliban has been seen as an American or African or even Irish slave, literally in bondage or bound by cultural chains of language and custom. And as Russ MacDonald said, the colonialist reading in the past decade has demonized Prospero, sentimentalized Caliban, and tyrannized conferences and journals with a new orthodoxy as one-sided as the one it sought to replace. Here is just an example to see how Caliban was represented in 1904 in a London staging, and this is how he appears in The Tempest from 2010. By the way, Helen Mirren is Prospero, so Prospero has to be a woman. It's not men alone who prosper. And Caliban, of course, here is racialized. Shakespeare doesn't racialize Caliban. For him, Caliban does not belong to any race. The problem is if he belongs to the human race at all. That's the problem, not if he is black or white or other color. And as Harold Bloom said, our archetypal, politically correct article today should be Caliban and the discourse of colonialism, or Ariel and the economy of exploitation, or even Prospero and mercantilism. Stephen Greenblatt, in particular, read one of the central passages in The Tempest in a way which I think is highly problematic. This is the passage that I'm going to refer to. It's given generally in the first folio edition, it's given to Miranda, but critics think it should be given to Prospero. This is what Prospero tells the monster. Abhorred slave, which any print of goodness will not take, being capable of all ill. I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or other, when thou didst not, savage, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gabble like a thing most brutish. So Caliban couldn't speak at all, right? He was like an animal. He taught him language. I endowed thy purposes with words that made them noun, but thy vile race, species, though thou didst learn, had that in it which good natures could not abide to be with. Therefore wast thou deservedly confined into this rock, who hadst deserved more than a prison. And Caliban answers, You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. By the way, Prospero taught Caliban language, not a language. Langage, not langue, right? If we were to speak in linguistic terms. Because he was without language at all. The red plague rid you for learning me your language. Now, this your becomes very important to Greenblatt, who thinks that here we have the startling encounter between a lettered and an unlettered culture. Unlettered, but Caliban couldn't even speak. It's not that he was unlettered. In the poisoned relationship between master and slave, Caliban can only curse. It's his right because he was oppressed. It is precisely to validate such high-sounding principles that the Indian languages are peeled away and discarded like rubbish by so many of the early writers. This is a cultural materialist, a new historicist reading in which, of course, it's an encounter between oppressed and oppressor, between an illiterate culture. But actually, Shakespeare understood it in the terms of the Renaissance, which are closer to Pico della Mirandola than they are to Greenblatt and Marx. In Pico della Mirandola's Discourse on the Dignity of Man, published in 1486, God tells man, Adam, that this is what he tells Adam. Adam, we give you no fixed place to live, no form that is peculiar to you, nor any function that is yours alone. To you is granted the power of degrading yourself into the lower forms of life, the beasts, and to you is granted the power contained in your intellect and judgment to be reborn in the higher forms, the divine. The problem with Caliban is whether he wants to stay fully animal or he wants to evolve into humanity. But this, of course, and I don't have the time here to enter into Shakespeare's subtleties, this, of course, is at the same time very ironical, because at the end of the play, men, the traitors, Antonio, Alonso, Sebastian, actually do not repent. Like Iago, they are as evil at the end as they were at the beginning. The only character who repents is Caliban, who says, I'll be wise hereafter, and seeks for grace. Caliban, the animal, the cannibal, Ban, Caliban, has a new master, got a new man. The born slave, the creature littered on the island by Sycorax and Setebos, a demon, is now the most human or humane. He has received grace, he has been saved, and this is why Prospero can acknowledge this thing of darkness, his. I'll talk about one last trend which is particularly fashionable today, eco-criticism or eco-feminism as it became. It's also about agency and control, and one scholar said that like racism and misogyny with which it is often allied, ecophobia is about power. In the Marxist scheme, everything is about power, right? All of Shakespeare is about power. There are many storms in Shakespeare, as you all know, and perhaps the most famous one is in King Lear, and Codrin has already mentioned it. But how do they read it? In a meteorological, eco-critical way, in which the weather should be read in our particular contemporary moment of climate change, and this is how the storm is read in the terms of eco-criticism. Now, the storm in King Lear corresponds to a tempest in King Lear's mind. There is there a connection between the microcosm and the macrocosm. Such storms appear in most of Shakespeare's late plays, and especially in all four romances. Marina in Pericles said, "The world to me is like a lasting storm," right? So the storm is a symbol, a metaphor of human condition. In The Tempest was stirred by Prospero. It's a tempest made by art, and it corresponds to a disorder in human affairs, treachery, murder, plotting, and so on. In The Winter's Tale, Paulina curses Leontes to dwell in storm perpetual upon a barren mountain and still winter in storm perpetual. That storm is actually the storm in his soul. Now, I don't know how much meteorological or eco-critical things how much they can tell us and about Shakespeare's plays, but that's not the point. They are missing the point. How would Shakespeare be read without theory? He would be read from the inside to the outside, not from the outside to the inside. Not starting from theory with some presupposed framework in a scheme that is ideological, but he should be read with some attention to the text and to the historical context and to the intention of the author, because Shakespeare did not have anything to say about racism and weather change, climate change. Of course, other critics have opposed this, although this now seems to be the major trend. And I would just quote Brian Vickers, one of the greatest Shakespearean scholars, who wrote a book about appropriating Shakespeare, Graham Bradshaw about misrepresentations of Tom McAlinden. As Bloom explains, in French Shakespeare, the procedure is to begin with a political stance of your own, far out and far away from Shakespeare's play, and then to locate some marginal bit of English Renaissance social history that seems to sustain your stance. Social fragment in hand, you move in from outside upon the poor play and find some connection, however established, between your supposed social fact and Shakespeare's words. One of my greatest models in intellectual affairs is George Steiner, and I was so glad to find this passage in Steiner, who says that he has conducted his emotional, intellectual, and professional affairs in distrust of theory. The invocation of theory in the humanities, in historical and social studies, in the evaluation of literature and the arts seems to me mendacious. The humanities are susceptible neither to crucial experiments nor to verification, except on a material documentary level. Our responses to them are narratives of intuition. In the unbounded dynamics of the semantic, in the flux of the meaningful, in the uncircumscribed interplay of interpretations, the only propositions are those of personal choice, of taste, of echoing affinity, or deafness. And of course, I count all these approaches to Shakespeare as personal choice, taste, and deafness. And I agree that they are legitimate. What I question is their pertinence to what Shakespeare actually wrote. I mean, can they really explain the text? Can they say anything meaningful about Shakespeare's texts? They certainly tell us a lot of meaningful things about our present concerns, but do they tell us anything of any use about Shakespeare? I doubt that. What then? Well, one of the things that I have been questioning a lot these past years is that we should go back to daring to be banal and stating truth about literature as it comes from the text. And yes, I do believe there is such a thing as truth. I do believe there is such a thing as an author, historical author. I do believe there is such a thing as human nature. I do believe there is such a thing as God and man and meaning and words with meaning and so on. And of course, those are open to interpretation, but not totally far from what they intend to say. Alexandru Paleologu, one of the most important Romanian essayists for the foreign participants, wrote in one of his books, which is called Common Sense as Paradox, that paradoxes often rehabilitate banality. And Shakespeare is a paradoxical writer. The white and black in the sonnets is paradoxical. The white and black in Othello is paradoxical. But the interpretation, in a way, should dare to be banal. What a shock effect sometimes comes from reaffirming some of those vérités premières that we tend to forget. Right? The vérité première, taking the sense as it is, not as we would like it to be. And I should praise a thing here. You see, university today, and now this is general criticism, university today is tyrannized by the imperative of publishing or perishing. Publish or perish. We are all measured. Hirsch index, quotients. Is it first, second, third? Is it here or there? Is it WOS or Scopus or whatever? You have to publish something new. You have it to be original. Where there is one place where you can escape being original at the expense of being reasonable and sensible, and that is in teaching. Because in front of first, second, third year students, they don't expect it to be highly original or to say something that no one has said before. You can still say the vérité première. You can still dare to be banal when you teach. I think university should be once again focused upon teaching truth to students rather than producing stupid, useless articles that ultimately nobody reads, that have become like a cancer because nobody can keep up with criticism on any particular field of human knowledge. And this is what I have started doing with my Shakespeare series, not giving a damn whether what I said has already been said 20, 50 times, which with Shakespeare you can swear it has. I just want to say what I think there is in the text without caring for any ideological pressure. Another important thing is perhaps going back to the historical philological method, going back to philology. Because our faculties from philology, they have become schools of literature. From literature, they have become ideology or languages or applied languages. And at the end of the day, nobody still speaks about the great texts. We choose marginal texts just because they are marginal. And we no longer talk common sense in university. Theory, David Scott Caston, one of also the greatest Shakespeare scholars of the present day, wrote, "Theory cannot in its own terms often offer convincing alternatives. Theory can complicate and contest the categories of analysis, but the clarification and correction of those categories, the necessary specification of the process by which meaning and value are produced and grounded, can only come through historical scholarship." Or as T.S. Eliot said in Hamlet and His Problems, there is nothing to interpret. You just stick to the reality and explain to students what they can't understand themselves. When Shakespeare sends Ophelia, when Hamlet sends Ophelia to a nunnery, you should understand that in Elizabethan slang, nunnery also meant brothel. This is the historical philological method. You tell students what they can't know because they have lost the context. You don't tell them what you think Shakespeare should have said if he had been as enlightened in terms of critical race theory as we are. And finally, to finish this very, how should I say, a flamboyant defense of old philology and of common sense, I would like to quote someone who, of course, cannot be reduced to the field of gay studies. He would be appalled if he were reduced to that. Oscar Wilde, who has nothing but his genius to declare, as you know. And he said, through the voice, in the picture of Dorian Gray, I can't remember exactly who said it, he said, "Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things," or I should say ideological meanings in literature, if you wish, "those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things," take Shakespeare's sonnets, "are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book, or a politically correct or politically incorrect book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all." With this return to new aestheticism, I shall finally rest my case and apologize for being a bit too long today. Thank you very much.